Hey everybody, good evening and welcome to tonight's discussion of technology and our kids. Talking about a topic that I know every single one of you out there has discussed, you've debated. It's I'm a parent, a recent parent, and even grappling with my 2-year-old. We were laughing today about how she was negotiating to watch more episodes of Peppa Pig. And even at 2, the battles begin. So it's a lifelong battle. And it's actually really funny. Driving back over the weekend, we're up at the lake and we're talking about watching a few episodes of Peppa. And we're talking, she's like, let's watch one episode. My daughter said 2 or 3. I said, we'll do 2. Two's pretty good. And my 2-year-old said 3's pretty good. And so already out of the gate, we are negotiating. It's pretty funny. And eventually I know this is going to be about screen time and can I have a cell phone? I've even had a 12-year-old tell me, when your kid turns 12, give her a cell phone. So it's already beginning. There is something here. We have a poll. It'll take all of 35 seconds. So Albert, let's kick it off. Are you a student, a parent, an educator? Just click that. If you are or have a student, are they freshman, rising senior, are they in college, elementary school? Is curious, the audience. And then, do you need any sort of help this summer from Apple Ruth? And then, would you want anyone to reach out? And you finish that, and then we are done and off to the races. So, all right, let me close that out myself. All right, now let's go ahead and begin. We're going to have time at the end for hopefully what's going to be a vibrant Q&A session, because I know all of you are, have dealt with this and are dealing with this right now with yourselves, with your kids. Technology, it's interesting and challenging. Learning how to define good boundaries for ourselves, for our kids. We'll also share a copy of the deck with you and a copy of the recording. So know that you don't have to take down any notes if there are any things that are written here. It'll be coming your way, and we'll have hopefully a good Q&A at the end. Let us jump right in. So dealing with technology, it's going to be something that we deal with our entire lives. We're seeing it. I'm seeing it now as a father, and I know it only continues. For this talk, I was talking to my sister and my brother. Their kids are they're teens, late teens, almost 20, and how they've negotiated, how they've managed this. And everyone has their own philosophy and their own approach, and their own boundary. It's interesting seeing how different parents take different approaches with different kids, and how different families have very different systems of how they approach cell phones and tablets and the internet. And some of them, it's very, very bounded. Some of them, it's very loose. And there really is no right answer. It's trying to figure out what's right for your family and for your kids as they mature and develop and grow. So I mentioned earlier on the way back this weekend, my daughter was clamoring for more Peppa Pig. And then later it's, my niece, she's 12 and, doing the video on TikTok and more time on that, or on Roblox. And then eventually I work with many, many kids who are in high school and college, and they're on Snapchat and doing their snap streaks, and they're talking to their friends. So, it's there. And as adults, we are plugged into, my wife and I, we're playing on spelling bee on the New York Times, trying to compete and get genius level or queen bee. So we're doing the same thing they're doing, just in our 40s versus in our teens. So it's with us all the way through. And part of the challenge when you're dealing with teenagers is the whole thing about performance and the culture of performance, of performing a self, and the focus on external validation and seeking feedback. I even watching my 14-year-old nephew, looking at how many things he's going through, liking and thumbing up and just doing these little validation things. And him and his friends, we spent in April, we were together down in the beach. Him and like 20 friends were counting to 1 million via text. And they were each he had like, how many times did you post? Like a couple hundred. They're just counting to 1 million. I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they're connecting in some strange way, but my friends are doing it. I'm doing it. It's very interesting stuff. Ultimately, I thought it was pretty inane, but it's amazing, watching kids and their devices, how they interact with them. And so many young people, this for their kids, they're seeking validation in some way from their peers. Part of this, though, some of the risks, we know you could be posting about things that aren't that smart. I've had over the past 20 years of working with kids, I remember one of my students, he showed me stuff, his Facebook, and he had pictures of him taking bong hits at a party. And I'm like, you're going to be applying to college. And what are you doing with your, in Snapchat, but doing stupid things, but wanting some kind of validation affirmation from his peers. And for a young man, I get it. You're macho and cool, but like there are costs, tied to this. Additionally, everyone experiments at some point with power dynamics and with bullying, saying mean things. Some people send pictures of themselves they shouldn't send. They get in trouble that way. And kids ask the question of how many followers do I have? How many people like my posts? How long are my snap streaks? One of my students, amazingly, he's now going to college next year in Boston. Whenever we talked, we were talking about executive functioning over the course of about a year, and organization, how things are going with school. But he'd tell me about his relationship, and he had this long snap streak going with the girl he was seeing. They broke up, but they still kept talking every day to keep their snap streak going after they broke up. I'm like, what's happened that we've been so hijacked that actually they keep the snap streak going even though they weren't dating anymore, just to maintain this number. And so they're smart people going to good schools but doing very silly things with technology. So I think it's important, and I try to talk to him. I'm a peer, 30 years his senior, but just this external validation and becoming slaves to our machines. It's like I remember running in circles when we first got the Fitbit, trying to hit our 10,000 steps, or closing our rings on the iPhone, and just needing, like, we're beholden to these machines. And kids do it too. We do it as adults, and kids do it too, obviously, trying to keep things going, get things to light up for us. There was a whole thing of online trading, and people, when you made a trade on, Robinhood, and then there's like balloons would go off. Like you spent money, yay. Or you send money in Zelle or on Venmo, it's like, yay, I sent money. And we're, these little dopamine things that we're tied into. And so they have all these psychologists trying to figure out, how do we get you hooked in? How do we give you these little rewards? And for teenagers, these rewards are even more important than for adults. We have a much more developed frontal cortex than our kids. And so part of it, if it affects us, it affects them even more, and being mindful of that. And so one of the challenges when you're needing all the validation externally from others, from peers, from machines, it's a weakening of the sense of our inner self. And typically when people should be writing in their journal, they're posting, looking for thumbs up or likes or some kind of affirmation externally. And that actually weakens the self and weakens our identity. And so we're spending, we're looking at the world often through screens. We're not looking directly at things. We're looking through a screen, and that changes how we view things, how we view the world, how we view ourselves. And additionally, there have been many articles, books written about how there's a heightened sense of isolation. And we know that there is more anxiety, there's more depression, there's more suicide, there's more suicidal ideation among young people. I've seen it, and I'm sure many of you have too. If you're parents, I know my friends who have kids who were teens. Some of them went through really hard times during the pandemic, and social isolation. It's very expensive, and it seems like the world we live in, there's just more social isolation, and so these devices, it's a double-edged sword. And there was a Pew Research study that's showing just how prevalent being tethered to our devices has become for teenagers. And back in 2015. About a quarter of young people said they were almost always connected to their internet, and now it's up to about half. So half of teenagers in America between 13 and 17 are almost always tied in, almost always on the net, which is a lot. And it's just, even smartphone access. It used to be 50%. Then 5 years ago, it was 35%. Now 95% of adolescents have a smartphone, or have access to one, whether it's their parents or their own. So it's pretty powerful that our culture is changing. And the idea of, we're just gonna put these things away and throw them out the window. It's like, no, this is our world. But now, how do we live in this world? How do we live in it and live in it well? And so the shift to digital engagement, there are costs. We'll talk about that today. There's a researcher I liked, Jean Twenge. I heard her 3 times when she was promoting her book on the circuit. I had 3 different conferences I went to around the country. And she was pulling from this study that's been ongoing for now, it's like 48 years. out of Michigan, looking at the mental health of our adolescents. So it really is quite relevant to you if you have teenagers, and what's going on with these kids. And one of the big things is we're sleeping less, that kids are sleeping less than they were 20, 30 years ago. There's more deprivation, and that can affect our emotional self-regulation, levels of anxiety, depression, self-esteem, all these things without sleep. We know we are spending more time on our devices. We saw the Pew poll said they're almost always tethered. This research from Michigan just gave you an example that it's about 6 hours a day. Adolescents are looking at devices. And honestly, for adults, if you actually begin tracking it, it's somewhat often surprising. I learned when I first began using my screen time app, I was up to 4.5 hours a day, which is not that different than these teenagers. So I've been very intentional about trying to reduce that and my wife and I both began to challenge ourselves to, can we use it less? And she actually activated something where it quantified how often she picked up her phone when she was during the course of the day and at work. And when she began tracking, it was every 4 or so minutes. And she'd pick up for one purpose to get a text from her mom or something, but then she'd go on and look at something else or a news site. But over time, she coached herself to track it less, use it less. And so that feedback was helpful, but it's often amazing when you actually track something and you realize, oh my God, I'm looking at my phone so much. And if we are, then of course our kids are too. And I remember even 10, 20 years ago, like how many times kids were texting, and the numbers were pretty astounding, especially female adolescents, like hundreds of texts. It's pretty amazing. And we know there's research that more than 5 hours plugged into our phones has cost for teenagers. It affects sleep, it affects, there was an increase in suicidal ideation risk factors, and also a decrease in happiness. So people who are on the phone a ton tend to be less happy, but compared to those who use a device under an hour. There's a challenge though, in terms of, is it correlation or causation? That people who tend to be anxious or depressed are going to spend more time on their phones, or is it causal? Is the time on the phones causing depression, anxiety? That's something to be worked out still with future research, but we know they seem to be going together. And there's some evidence here of correlation. So if you spend more time doing these analog activities, in-person activities, they tend to increase happiness. More time doing sports tends to increase affect and mood and lower anxiety. More time sleeping, better mood, less anxiety, less depression. Seeing your friends in person, less anxiety, less depression. Reading books and magazines. Going to activities with groups, whether it's group sports or church or temple or mosque. So when we do these in-person human activities, we tend to feel less lonely and have less anxiety. So that is part of the challenge of understanding this, but also knowing that our kids are going to have their phones. Like they're here and they're probably here to stay. Most certainly are. And so it's just learning how to talk to our kids. One of the things I talk to my students with is about comparison culture and this need to cultivate a self, a persona. I'm trying to craft a self. If I know someone's tracking my Spotify playlist, am I going to listen to different things? Am I going to try to perform versus have an authentic, experience? And part of it is being authentic. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes things are flat and it isn't always exciting. And if I have to try to perform with the pictures that I take of myself, with the things I try to post and be witty or clever, it takes a lot out of us. And also it creates this sense of FOMO, and I'm always looking at your performance and, this sense of life you're creating. I begin to feel less good about my own life. And so I think as parents, talking to kids about this, talking about FOMO, talking about what's real, what's not real, it's meaningful. We do know that, kids in the past 10 years, they're spending less time together. And so it's amazing. I can think of, myself, I'm Gen X, but kids today are spending 2 hours per week less going to parties than we did. And I remember, we went to parties Friday, Saturday to go out and drive around. Also, kids are getting their driver's license later. Kids are it's amazing. They're drinking less, having sex less. They're on their phones more, but all the other things they're doing less. That's all in this book. They're also working less. I had a job. All these, there's less in person. There's more digital engagement. And here again, it went in college. College kids now are spending 4 fewer hours a week socializing in person and 3 fewer hours partying. So that's 7 hours they're spending less engaging, and that can impair us socially. One thing there's a lot more ghosting of people these days, a lot more like he's closing. I don't want to deal with a hard situation or a conflict, therefore I'm going to ghost and I'm not going to respond. And that's definitely more prevalent now. And part of it, have we lost some of the skills that we would have gained through in-person interaction? So as parents, part of it is really encouraging whenever there's an opportunity for in-person human interaction, get kids together, it's better. And they are doing it less than we used to do. So that's one corrective we can do. And in general, less time together, it's making us worse mammals. Because part of it, when we're together, we can see our faces, we can read cues, we can see body language, hold hands, hug, touch. There's less of that now. And that may be what's going on with this increased level of anxiety and depression and even suicidal ideation. There's a mental health aspect. I think part of it is our devices, not all of it. There are other things happening in the world, but definitely there is something of a mental health epidemic. It's been written up in many magazines, articles. You see it. I have friends who are counselors on the college level and they're seeing it. They're booked up. So I think part of it is trying to encourage our people to get outside and play and see their friends and all the stuff that we know was good for us, helped us regulate ourselves, encouraging our kids. So it's important that you start the conversation as early as possible about technology, about boundaries, about the use of technology that's healthy or safe. Ideally, I have a 2-year-old who wants to watch Peppa Pig all day. And it's amazing how fixed, she is. And even like the commercials, I'm very wary about watching on YouTube TV because we watch Peppa Pig and their commercials, and then she is just glued to the commercials. And I'm like, oh gosh, you're being manipulated, you're being sold to, you have no idea. And as the wiser adults in late 40s and 2, I can help structure. But even if your kids are 14, 15, having conversations that things they're not yet aware about. I think kids need explicit instruction on the ups and downs of technology use and overuse. I want them to become informed users. And as they grow and their brains develop, they'll take over more control. But as parents, if you're dealing with a 10-year-old, you have a lot more control. And as they get older, you ease up, but you're still engaging them in conversation and discourse about their use. It's a sure thing that your kids are going to find ways to outsmart you as you try to regulate their technology, because they're just savvier than we are. The same as we were savvier than my parents are. And, it's funny, my sister, like my nephew went and he was limited on his phone. His screen time was limited. He went and jerry-rigged her phone to look like his phone and created these, he was doing all this switching and how are you doing this? But because they're smart and this is their generation, they're digital natives. And in some cases, when kids really have problems, this is from my psychiatrist friend, that you have to have a lockbox where you actually physically lock down the devices if kids really can't control them. By the time your kids are in high school, that's not really a thing. But when they're 10, 11, 12, and they're just staying up late, going online, and that's when you may have to actually impose some strong rules. And your kids may hate it, but part of it is you have to give up being liked. When your parents, our role isn't to be liked, we're not friends, and we have to sometimes really impose structure. I don't like being so strict that it's so contentious, but I think we have to be the ones to hold the boundaries and define them. And as kids get older, we negotiate with them, and then we set rules together. But when they're younger, we can create the law and uphold it. So reasonable boundaries, they're really key. And if you make it so tight and there's no room and no air, it's going to create some tension. And kids, there's more rebelliousness, there's more sneakiness, there's more. And if it's too loose, though, and there's no oversight and no controls whatsoever, kids can fall into some bad places. There has to be some level of oversight, whether you're observing, whether their phone is rooted and you're seeing everything that they send and text. And different parents have different levels of oversight. And as kids get older, you decrease that. You don't want too much surveillance, because then your kids, there's going to be some rebellion, and ultimately they have to learn how to manage these things themselves. There's definitely a middle ground, but as they get older, they earn the right to have more freedom. So it's important we all understand that the internet, it's life-changing, world-changing, amazing, engaging. We're not just socializing; we're also learning. And if you're like me, I do most of my learning now online, and I play podcasts on my phone. I get some information through books, but it's now probably a fraction compared to what it was 30 years ago. And there's also, kids are learning to express themselves with they're talking, they're connecting, they're joking, they're sharing things, they're creating things. And so they're building friendships. And often the in-person friendships, they're extended through the online back and forth, the same as my friends. We text and chat and send each other stupid stuff, same as, as our kids are. They're also learning and problem solving, creating things. And so kids who have no connectivity, that's not great for them. There actually is some research that it's a little bit harmful if they have, because, the world is connected. And if they have no connections, that's not going to be great for their development. And so there is a sweet spot. And generally, social media, there probably isn't much of a need for that when kids are before middle school. But then often in middle school, kids get a cell phone for picking you up, but it's limited in certain ways. And parents have total access. By the time, kids start going to ninth grade, you begin to have some more freedom. It becomes more your device, not my device in most cases, not always, but still there are going to be checks and verification before things are sent and whatnot. It's important, and this is really a big one, that we as parents are doing all of the modeling. Doesn't matter what we say, it doesn't even matter what our contracts are. The kids are looking to us to figure out what's appropriate, what kind of boundaries we should be having. And when devices are new, it's so easy to have really bad boundaries, because sometimes aspects of parenting are really boring. And there are times, you see it on the playground where parents are looking at their devices, not their kids. Even there's a whole thing of breastfeeding mothers looking at their device first, bonding with their babies. And and one of my good friends, when his kids were very, very small, so it was really a challenge for him to put his phone down when his kids were playing and he was there to make sure they were safe, but also it's a chance to be interacting and communicating. And part of it, at the dinner table, having device-free zones. On vacation, we're not going to have free for all. And you're modeling what you want them to do. There's elements of safety and security that's important to talking to our kids about people who we don't know. If someone messages you don't know them, hey, I met you at a party, like I'm Olivia XYZ. Just make sure you talk about safety with kids, with guys and girls both, about not everyone, you make sure you know who people are. That's an important basic thing. One of my colleagues talked about before her daughter posts on TikTok, she makes sure I approve it. This is again before high school, but early, when someone's 11, 12, because things do live forever. And sometimes our judgment is not as good as we're learning. We want likes, and I don't want to be doing dumb things for validation and so forth. There's also a conversation I've been hearing for years about Instagram, as young people now are pivoting from Facebook to Instagram, Snapchat. But still, it's the same thing. People used to be performing a self. Gosh, back in the day, it was MySpace and Friendster, then Facebook, now in Instagram. And so part of it, again, we talked about understanding what's performative, understanding people spend 50 shots to get the right angle and the right lighting, and that's not real, none of it's real. And kids, it's interesting. They can know it's fake. And I've heard students say, I know it's all garbage, but still, if you scroll through it passively, it still affects you, even though you have this knowledge that people are performing and it's not what their lives are like all the time. It can still affect you emotionally. So it's balancing, a surface level knowledge and a very deep understanding. And some people do have their fake Instagram for the world, and then they have their real one for their 10 friends that they can actually be real with and be vulnerable with. And so, I think it's important talking about, our device, how learning works. And this is where I've had most of my discussions over the past 15 years with kids about technology, with learning, because I've been a tutor for many years, and it's my livelihood. And so when students are struggling academically, I talk about, when you're doing your work, do you have your devices open? Because every time you get pinged, every time there's a notification, your attention is disrupted for minutes. And your processing becomes much more shallow. Your encoding of the material becomes more shallow. Your memory of it becomes more diminished. So, and my brother's a teacher up in Toronto and tells me, when the kids have their phones out, or when he's doing online class, he knows that they're getting a fraction of the material that they would get if their phones were away. And one of my good friends is a Harvard professor, and he talks about, the kids have their machines open, their phones are here and their laptops are open. But he knows that so many of them are not attending to him during his lecture. And a certain portion are, but a lot of them are lost. And so there's so much learning loss because of our devices, and learning is much more shallow. And that's just a phenomenon. So I think talking to kids about that is real. And also, if you're trying to learn something, having, you need to have a depth of focus, and being pinged all the time or distracted will really degrade your learning. If you care about the subject, you got to, we're not good at multitasking. That's just we're not, our brains aren't built for it. 2 out of 100 people can parallel process and do 2 things at the same time without degrading the accuracy. Everyone else, though, we try to do 2 things at once, they both are diminished. So we're not good at multitasking. One counter to all of the fast, quick things that we're seeing in chats and quick video, forms is encouraging any long form reading that you can. And so if you have the chance to encourage and then model, demonstrating, building attention and concentration and focus, long form focus, please do it. And that's something, if ever kids are reading anything that you can validate, oh, it's wonderful you're reading. That's a good thing. And also let your kids see you reading. Yes, there's a question, will this be posted? Yes, we're going to send you a link to the presentation. Okay. I'm sorry. And so if you want your kids to read, they have to see you reading. And that's something, I grew up in a household where my parents were always reading. And they went on vacations and my parents would bring like 5 books. And we understood that reading was an Apple Ruth family value. That was something that we did. And all of us like to read. And part of it, it's interesting. My wife and I, Sue's, we've been reading the New York Times online, but we decided to actually go and get a physical paper. Like, I haven't had a physical paper in years, but just so Juliet can see us reading a paper, and that's not a screen. And so it's something of an artifice. We would ordinarily, but for her, we'd read it online. But to make sure that she sees that we, as adults, we read magazines, papers, other things, long form stuff, and on the couch, like dad's reading, you're reading, to really validate that. It's a good thing to reinforce that. Another good boundary has to do with when you're driving. And it's so interesting. I remember learning years ago that trying to model like how you drive. It's one thing, like, your kids learn how you drive when they're about 7 or 8 years old. So even if you slow way down when they're 14, 15, doesn't matter. They've already imprinted on how fast you go, how aggressive you are. So, they're learning when they're 7, when they're 8. And if you're talking on the phone a lot, and not to them, you're teaching them about non-communication and who's more important, the person on this little thing or the person next to me. And I've had to get on my mom for that. There are times she picks up phone calls like, Mom, I'm in the car with you. Tell them you'll call them back later. So part of it is coaching our parents in their late 70s, but also for us ourselves modeling, because our kids, we're always teaching by how we are, how we do. What we say doesn't mean a lick. It's what we do. And so telling them they're important by giving them your attention. And then so they will have the same thing for their friends and so forth. It's important that kids understand about privacy. This is for my sister, talking about, how much you're giving away. And what are the terms? No one's going to read all the terms, but understanding that the basics, that if they're going to be tracking everything and they're getting my contacts and getting other stuff, like, what am I selling for my attention? And what am I agreeing? So being thoughtful. So my sister and my niece is 12. Michelle is very tight about what she lets her download, because again, some of these things are taking the world in exchange for having this app, which is free, but it's not remotely free. It's, you are the product and your data is what they're buying. We want to teach them about being savvy consumers early, because again, they're going to have to navigate these things later on their own. Don't just download everything without thinking, what am I giving up? So again, the whole thing is a conversation. Everything's a conversation, and you have it over time when they ask you, can I download this or buy this and so forth. So boundaries. One of the biggest things is setting boundaries and having consequences, because naturally teenagers are going to push, they're going to overstep, and they're going to see how does this world work? What can I get away with naturally? And that's their job. If they didn't, they wouldn't be good teenagers, And so part of it is like when they get the screen time, and this is for my nephew who's 14. Like, you can't spend 3 hours on the screen, then do a really shoddy job on your homework and stay up late and then turn in bad work. We have to change the order of things, and if you're the parents, you can structure that with them. And also limits that, Elliot, it's at 9 o'clock. You have your phone, but at 9 o'clock it's off. And if you're on beyond that, then tomorrow the phone's mine. like logical, natural, fair, reasonable consequences. And then you have to follow through. If you set a boundary and you don't follow through, you are losing all credibility forever. And different families do it differently. There are underbounded families where it's a total free-for-all. The device is yours. God bless you. And then overbounded, and where there is, it's so tight. And, so it depends on that relationship. And, I like where there's flexibility in certain conditions. You can have the phone a little more for these, you have a compelling reason. You're talking to a friend, XYZ, something happened to a friend of yours, no problem, rather than being totally rigid. And there's no exception ever. I don't like walls like that. I like being responsive to the environment, but also no oversight. You're missing opportunities to teach your kids and have them learn. And it's funny because I grew up in a household, it was 1981. Like my parents didn't put a bound on TV. There were no screen time limits in my household. And as a kid, I watched a lot of TV. And then I had a Nintendo, and I bought the games. There were no limits. And playing all the quests, King's Quest and Spade, I would play for hours and hours. And my parents were pretty loose, but ultimately we were doing our work. Things were okay. There was never really a problem, but it's interesting seeing my siblings parent differently versus how lax my families were in the early 80s, the mid 80s and so forth. There is a question here. How do you get the phone away from a 15-year-old child if they say no, and they will not physically give you the phone? And this is a part of it, as the parent, there are times you're going to be very much unliked. And, this may vary. I don't know the context. Is there a stronger adult? Because, you can't, if there's a scenario where the 15-year-old is refusing, there have to be consequences. And it's either, if I don't get this phone, there are going to be, very meaningful consequences, and you're going to lose XYZ. Because part of it is you can't let it's not their phone. Ultimately, it's like, they have access to it, but it's the idea of the phone as a right, as a natural right, some kind of thing. And it isn't a natural right. It's an earned privilege, and make sure that's understood. And that's the contract. And you're going to have to establish a contract. And and if you violate the contract, you lose this privilege. So that's a real important reframe. And so there have to be, and so in terms of wrestling away physically versus saying, hey, listen, if I don't get this phone back, that thing you wanted in exchange for this, you lose this. And they're going to have to be boundaries, because otherwise, if the kids run the house, it's going to be problematic. So, but I've seen it. You've seen videos of a father smashing a Sega Genesis like with a baseball bat, just because the kid wouldn't turn it off, and that's a bit traumatic. But ultimately, the parents have to have control over the devices, and the kids, it is a privilege. It's not a natural right. Okay, so all right, moving on. So I believe it's very important that you do understand as a parent that there are absolutely red flags. There are things that you have to watch out for. This is for my friend, the psychiatrist. Like if kids really feel like my life stinks and everyone's life is so great, and that can affect self-esteem. If sleep gets disrupted, that's a real problem. You have to watch that, attend to that. If body image, body dysmorphia, there's a lot of the comparison culture. And it's interesting, like the boys often are having the camera pointing outwards, looking at things they're seeing, and girls often put the camera towards themselves. And that's the performance and the whole, am I pretty? Am I nice to look at? How many likes do I look good in this? And that, there's a lot more. There's the eating disorders. My friend specializes in this, and anorexia and bulimia and other problems. And for males, there's a whole thing of like bigorexia. Am I manly enough, strong enough? If that's a new currency, I have to look a certain way. And again, so body dysmorphia happens, but it's more frequently found right now in females. And so being thoughtful about that in this performance culture. And then being thoughtful that there's bullying. And bullying happens in the real world and it happens in the digital world. And oftentimes, like, it's not just, dichotomous, you're a bully, you aren't a bully. Human beings are creatures of hierarchy. We come from, we align with chimpanzees and the bonobos, and, the chimps, there's a lot more hierarchy and aggression. And even good kids and nice kids are going to experiment with power, and they're going to experiment with joining and ganging up. They're going to experiment with bullying, and they'll probably have some experience being bullied. And so part of it is having the discussion with, how do you respond? What do you do with that? And then at what level? Because sometimes kids can get really hurt. And so I think it's, making sure there's an open line of communication with your kids, and, and so forth. But these are the important things. And finally, addiction. which is real. And in the DSM, they're talking about, addiction to technology and computers, and you hear about in other countries, kids like dying of gaming. And also affecting their vision and their health and obesity and other things, and cardiovascular health. So we can spend too much time sitting and looking at our device. That definitely is. So these are red flags. And here we go. You know what? There are some more comments coming in about controlling devices. Let me finish up some of the slides, but please keep asking questions and I'll get to them at the end. So I want to make sure I do have time. I see things are at 8:36. Okay. There is a site that I like that my colleague said, you know what, it's pretty handy. There's a guy, Ben Albert, whose whole thing is on safety and childhood safety, cyber safety. And there are free resources on his site, there are downloads, and there's a pledge. It's of like 50 things looking through. It's more geared towards middle school kids, so like maybe slightly tween, but also there are things that are relevant for teenagers too. And there are principles. I pulled like 15 or 20 to show you some examples. This is not a comprehensive list, but here are some things. I'm not giving away my information. I'm not going to have easy passwords someone to hack. My parents will know them. This is for kids in the school. My pictures aren't going to identify me in terms of where I live or that. If my parents want to follow me, I'm going to accept that. This is for kids, again, in middle school. And I'm going to know my virtual friends. They're actually people I know. They're not some person who's not who they say they are. Before I post a picture, I'm going to ask for permission, XYZ. I'm not going to create a profile my parents don't know about. I'm not going to use my smartphone during a meal. XYZ, when I go to bed, I'll charge my phone not in the room, all these things. And so again, this is just a list and you might go through it and just look for safety. But Ben Alpert's trying to keep people safe because some people do get hurt, and he's giving some examples of how people end up getting hurt. And so it's important when looking at technology and understanding that technology was designed by very smart people with big degrees to be incredibly addictive and compelling. It's smarter than we are. And so the kid who can't walk away from the game, it's not the kid is broken, but the game, it was designed to be so compelling and so addictive. So understand that. It's designed to grip us and hold us and enthrall us. And part of your, as an adult, understand that. Okay, that's how it's designed. And how it affects me, it's even multiplied how it's affecting my teenagers, and how it's tapping the teenage brain. Because the teenage brain is looking for exploration, is more drawn to risk than the adult brain. Then the reward circuitry wants that immediate gratification, that next dopamine hit, and I'm going to keep hitting it till it affects. I want validation, I want affirmation, even more than us in our 40s and 50s. And so this is the perfect storm for teenage kids to want to spend more time, like the way they've been designed to the teenage brain. It's like a lock to a key. So know how powerful these applications are, and know that the kids, they're going to get smarter and their brains keep developing. Part of in my career, I'm a coach for EF, for executive functioning, for helping kids manage themselves, their resources, inhibit distraction, focus, prioritize, plan, strategize. But adolescence, the frontal cortex, the part of the brain is still developing. It's the brain develops asynchronously. They may have amazing language skills, other problems, but in terms of self-regulation skills, it's still coming online, and will still keep developing until their 20s. And so they don't often have the ability to put the thing down. And some kids can, especially students with ADHD, they can inhibit that need. And so part of it is putting in place limits in advance before you have these big power struggles. And I realize some of you on this webinar have already had power struggles or are having them, and maybe they're coming in the future. And my colleague, this is her language, I know you want this in unlimited quantities, I get that, but I don't trust this device. If you show me you can take on more capable, we're going to give you more latitude. So part of it is you start off stricter, the whole, like if you're a teacher, don't smile until Christmas kind of thing, where you start off stricter and then you earn the right to more latitude as they demonstrate their ability to control themselves and regulate. But it's not a given, here it is. And if you start off with unlimited, it's much harder to begin to regulate it. Then there's going to be a lot more power and more upset and more emotion, and for sure. So other things, we're looking at a mindful use plan. And I love that framing of it, a mindful use plan. And then there are going to be cues for stopping. When this cue happens, we down regulate, downshift, turn it off. When we're having a meal, we're not looking at our phones, done. In this room or this time or family meetings, phones out. In the car, we talk to each other. And this will vary based on the age of the kid and the kid. When friends are over, we're not going to be looking at our phones, interacting, playing, whatever it is. We're going to have time limits on apps. We're not going to spend 3 hours. And again, this will vary as kids get older. They have more latitude here. There's going to be a wind down time at a certain time. The phones go away. There are limits, and there are times you have to ask for more time. If your kid is 11 or 12, they're on TikTok. We have a limit using screen time on the iPhone. But if you want more time, ask us. We'll talk about it. A yes or no, but it's not automatically you get unlimited time. So that to me, and as kids get older, there's less oversight, but ideally middle school, there's still some decent oversight. And you're going to work with kids and with high school students. I think it's talking to them about boundaries versus imposing. Teens definitely want to have some control, some autonomy, and collaboratively talking about, what makes sense, is better. There's a better chance of actually complying with the plan if you've talked about it together. And also don't get hyper-focused on screen time, but look at the quality of engagement interaction, not just time. Because there's like passive, I'm looking, I'm just liking, looking versus I'm creating. Because if someone's creating content, they're interacting, they're engaging, that's much better. So think about the kind and the quality of the engagement versus just the time. That's a different conversation versus I tracked it. Because it could be 5 hours of really interesting creative is better than 4 hours of just passive scrolling and so forth. And for me in my work, as an EF coach and a tutor for 2 decades, I always want to have good divisions between when the kids are working and when they're playing. And I'm all about kids having playtime, and I want them to be using Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok and all the fun things they're using. But when they're working, I want them to be working. And I talk about how, and I've had students staying up, 7 hours doing their homework, but they're doing their homework with everything blasting. Notifications coming in, Snapchat's hitting them, Instagram, Facebook. It's like, oh my gosh. So your 7 hours was actually about 3 hours of real work. And so the parents say they're working, they're till 1 a.m, but they're not really. And ultimately, if they would just have a clear division, now I'm working, and then I'm going to have this open, and if I can work for an hour and a half, take a break for 20, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is, but then I'll go on a video game, Fortnite, then I put it down, I work for another hour, 20-minute break, work. But when they're commingling it, that's when it all gets damaged. So all of my students I work with, I tell them when we're doing our work, we're actually working. And I want quality playtime, pure playtime and pure work time, because most humans, except for 2 out of 100, we can't multitask, and we diminish everything by doing so. And part of it is learning how you waste time, where you waste time, this self-knowledge, self-awareness. And I'm working with kids who are 17, 18, 19. I'm working with kids in college and how technology can throw them off. And like, what are your time sucks? And, and part of it, what I do is I manage myself using website blockers. I have a blocker called Stay Focused. And the human brain naturally wants to go to a lower, is naturally lazy and wants to downgrade to a lower cognitive task. So if I'm trying to write up a presentation or an article, but then I can go and play spelling bee with my wife, which is a little bit easier, picking out words, or I can go scroll through New York Times or Reuters. I'm going to want to downgrade to an easier task. So what I have set up the Stay Focused app. After 15 minutes doing spelling bee, it tells me, shouldn't you be working? And then it pivots to that. And so that to me is helpful. And I have my students use these things, or I have them use their screen time limits on their iPhone. So during between 4 and 6, they're not getting notifications from Snapchat. They're not getting these are locked down during their work period. That's pretty helpful. And then there's a frame from Seth Perler, an EF expert: make what's hard easy and what's easy hard. And if gaming or social media gets in the way, make it harder to access for the time we're trying to work. And some of my students, again, college kids, they study with their phone is charged in airplane mode, locked down when they're working. And these are, kids in college, as well as kids who are 14 and 15. So just being mindful that we're all going to have to work on these things, these devices. They're very tempting and very compelling, and you have to work with them. So understand if you are putting things off, what's behind that, and what's your plan going to be if they've been putting this off. And part of it is self-consequencing. If I finish this chapter, then I could spend half an hour and play this video game. And I have kids I work with who video gaming is very important to them. One of my students this year, he's actually going to Northeastern, and he'll be being part of this esports, like team. And he was like recruited. He's looking at 3 colleges where there's an esports. So gaming is huge for him. But part of it is when he's working, and then let's game for half an hour, but not go into a thing. And if I lose a game, get back in there, back in the queue, and then do another 3 rounds until you win. And suddenly your half an hour break becomes 2 hours. I'm like, we can't do that. But let's talk about how to manage it. And so half an hour we're gaming, and then it's off back to the work, and then after another hour back in the game. So this is all this negotiation with kids in high school, kids in college, kids in middle school, learning about how they function, how they fall into holes, because we all fall into holes as adults in our 40s and 50s, in our teens. We have to all learn how to use these devices. You got to make sure that other things aren't being squeezed out. As parents, if you notice they're not exercising, that's going to affect their mental health, their levels of anxiety, their academic work. Make sure if sleep is being diminished, that's a big red flag. Schoolwork, if that's suffering. And then also, friendships, relationships with the family. Technology can get in the way of these things. So you have to be mindful of these as good parents, good stewards for our kids. Other things that if there's too much time, too much idleness, and they're spending too much time on their devices, it's not great. Some downtime is great, but we have to find a way to keep kids more engaged. So there's more than just digital engagement, volunteer work, part-time jobs, summer jobs. And over the summer, it's not okay just to plug into your device for 3 months. And I'm sure as parents, there's some time that's structured. They're working, they're enriching, they're learning, they're for college admissions as well as just for their own development and health. And at night, really, really, really important that no one sleeps with their phone. Adults, my wife and I they're locked in the first, I think Esther Perel, she's this great counselor on relationships, talks about the last thing at night that you shouldn't be stroking your phone. It should be like, your spouse, your partner. Yet the first thing you touch shouldn't be a metal screen. It should be the person you love. I think is really nice for relationships. But don't sleep with your phone in the room or your tablet, put it away. And so kids, because at night, that's when the drama happens. That's when they're going to be up. Things are exciting, things are urgent, and they can be up for hours. And so if they have access to their device at night. And so I think even, 17-year-olds, all of us, we keep our phones charging at night, locked, turned off in the kitchen or in a drawer or whatever, not in your room. That's a good boundary for them to teach, because, once they're off in college, they're going to do their own thing, but just modeling again that we all do this is important. Self-care is important because sleep, when you disrupt sleep, you're going to disrupt learning gets really jacked up, and also emotional regulation gets jacked up. Our trigger response for stress, our ability to manage ourselves. So if you have a really bad sleep because of our devices, it's very expensive. And this is a little bit about memory formation. And it's the whole thing. If you disrupt sleep, memory gets totally hijacked. That's enough on that slide there. And you want to also think about the apps themselves. It's one thing to have the apps, but manage how they function. Like when there's something like autoplay, where it goes from one thing to the next, like Netflix or YouTube, where it just keeps feeding you. And then versus I have to actually actively stop the feeding, versus turning off autoplay is very simple and can help people regulate if they have a hard time with that. Additionally, turning off the push notifications. I have so few things that hit me because every ping, my mom's phone's like that, and she's just constantly bing, bing, like, stop, mom. It interferes with conversation and other things like that. But really stop the pushes and make sure you have to open the app to see what's notified or have a little red dot, not an active ping, whatever it is. So if you don't manage your apps, they're gonna manage you. And teach kids this. And then also the boundaries you set have to be kid dependent. You're going to have different boundaries for your different kids, not just gender-based, but even not in birth order, but just, for Jennifer, I can do this, but for Tim, he needs a different kind of plan. So, we want a use plan that's going to be age dependent. This kid can't play video games during the week, but weekend, okay, an hour a weekend, 2 hours, whatever it is. But some kids, their entire lives are tied up in their phones. So it's going to be, I think, unreasonable to say you can't touch your phone until you finish all your homework, because they're going to want to check in with their friends. But again, you have a check-in block. We're going to do our calculus for an hour and then 20 minutes. We're going to do our physics, this long project. We can't be doing the long form history assignment while we're texting our friends. that's going to just totally derail the project and the quality of it and our learning. But again, this has to be fluid and flexible as our kids grow. And again, tweens, youngins, young teens, typically the bedroom, minimize the technology. They can ask for permission. Can I FaceTime a friend, XYZ? But you're modeling for them. And part of it is don't make assumptions how much they're using, but when they're really young, you want to track it because you may be very, very surprised that they're on their phone 7 hours a day if the device is theirs. And then middle school, there's more leeway. You don't want to have this lockdown or they're going to become rebellious and sneaky, and there can be real tension. I'd rather, I don't want it too tight, but again, I don't want to be too loose. There's a sweet middle place. And as they get older, the mantra changes. And it's more of a discussion of how do you feel after you spend 4 hours on Instagram? Better? Worse? What are you avoiding by spending 4 hours doing the gaming? Do you feel better or worse? They're going to have to make connections. So you can't tell them when they're 16, 17, and they're about to go off to college and be adults. So it's not, I don't want to control you. I want to create an autonomous, independent young person. In high school, there's obviously a lot more management. You monitor it some in 9th, but the control shifts when they go in 10th and 11th, 12th. And when they screw up, you're there to help them and there to help them correct it. So there's still learning taking place. You can be their guide versus, this oppressive, contentious thing. I have one of my friends, Evan, his daughter is just 18, going to college next year. And he actually uses this Life 360 and tracks how fast she's driving. And she had a boyfriend who was going 90 miles per hour. It's like, hey, honey, not okay. Like you 17-year-old kid trying to impress you, whatever it is, let's work on that. So there is levels of oversight, what's appropriate, what's not, how much surveillance do you want to have? How much trust do you want to have? But there are times when this can be helpful to have a conversation like, yeah, your boyfriend was going 108 miles per hour. That isn't okay. And that's where some of these devices can be useful and instructive. Judy Wellman, my colleague, said it's important that parents have a posse, that if you have friends who have friends and their kids, they know each other, that having a network of parents, and sometimes if one parent notices something XYZ, they reach out, hey, my daughter mentioned XYZ about your son. Is he okay? This happened during the pandemic where one of my good friends, their daughter was posting some dark stuff. And then, one of the parents called and said, hey, your daughter's posting some dark things. I want to make sure you knew that. Is she okay? She's going through a hard thing, and she was going through a really hard spot. And so having a posse of parents who care about each other and they work to keep each other safe, I think is really helpful. And so that's a good thing. So we're all, it takes a village. And in terms of digital safety and health of our kids, I think the village metaphor is quite useful. Some good books. Sherry Turkle, lovely researcher. Alone Together, I guess this must be now 7, 8 years old when she was on the circuit. And Jean Twenge, that's books that must be now 4 years old or so. This is all pre-pandemic. But good books, really helpful, instructive. On Netflix, you could talk about the people who make these platforms, why they keep them from their own kids, and how this works. Pretty instructive, pretty helpful, pretty like an hour and a half, but I think a good movie to watch. My colleagues who helped me gave me some good tips. Psychologist, Dr. Judy Wellman, and child psychiatrist, Dr. Carrie Poline, married to my best friend, David. And so these folks are really helpful in making this discussion. So a few quick things. What we do, we help keep students with academics, with executive functioning coaching. We also help kids with test prep. There's a big weekend coming up where we're giving about 1,000+ kids practice tests for the SAT and ACT. We also have more on mental health. Next week, I'm giving a talk on building social emotional skills for kids. And also I'm giving a talk in August on anxiety management, something with my counseling background. And we're doing a writing workshop, kids who are working on becoming better writers in middle school, high school, and college even. And that's a big thing we've been working on for the past few years. Okay, so let us now answer questions. And how much time? We have a little more time too. So there's a fallacy out there that parents can monitor what the teen does on their phone. I'm the parent of a teen, and several of my friends have resorted to taking away the smartphones and giving a flip phone instead. And this, again, I know a lot of parents, some of them do have a different contract where there's monitoring, they intermittently review, whether not constantly, but the kids know there's going to be a check, and their phones are rooted, so they can go in and look. It's not constant. But I know this may not be possible for everybody. And you want to create a sense of conversation. And if there's too much control, some people are going to be rebellious. They're trying to, they want autonomy. And so I think the surveillance as kids get older, it naturally should decline. But there's a point of transition when it's my device to now this is your device. And this has to be negotiated. But I think as a parent, it's okay to have some conflict. And it's okay if your kid's staying up till 3 a.m. and say, this is a problem. And ultimately we are the parents. And even, again, it's not a right. And I think, hopefully you can avoid the huge power struggles by having conversations and starting earlier. But I do know parents who fought the good fight. But I know it can be really ugly sometimes in certain households. And what do you do if your teenage son is showing signs of addiction? And part of it, again, the intervention is you start with a conversation. And in terms of you want to be an ally to them, and it depends on the level of addiction. Is it interfering, again, with other activities, their normal daily functioning, interfering with hygiene? I live with a person who had an addiction when I was in my mid-20s, actually like mid-late 20s. And I lived with a guy from tech, and he would game, and his whole life was online, and his social life was online. But there was a whole thing where he wasn't showering. He was like hoarding dishes, and we shared a house, and it became a real problem. We had to have a conversation about hygiene. It was really an awkward conversation, talking to this guy who was a college kid. But ultimately, it was interfering with other things. And so, if there is a decline in function, grades, sleep, diet, self-care, relationships, it becomes a conversation. And then you may need to go and talk to a professional and get some support, a psychologist, someone who actually deals with this. There are folks who deal with addiction and internet addiction, because it can happen, for sure it can. But it's looking at, is there a decline in regular function? And then if there is, it's time for a discussion. You can't ignore that. My kids grew up in the growth of social media. No, I can't go back in time and grow with technology to teach better habits. My 16-year-old daughter is totally addicted to her phone. How to get her to self-police her social media, for me, versus controlling it. 16 is a hard age to have hard set rules for a teenager when they're learning independence at the same time. And that's right, because there are these countervailing forces that, we love our kids, but we know that individuation has to happen. That it's a prerogative that our kids become themselves and they're not enmeshed with us. But also, if we're seeing them going down a path that's negative or hurtful or destructive, as parents, it's our role to shepherd and try to guide and help them. The same thing if they're driving recklessly, and it's our thing, you could really hurt yourself. If they're getting towards substances, or you could hurt yourself with these. It says, part of it, there are some behaviors are really risky. And some there are consequences. So I think it may not be easy, but part of it, if you started late in the game, it may be a matter of leading not with control, but leading with your own vulnerability, your own discussions about areas that you've gone too far, you've made mistakes, trying to recruit them and engage them with a share of authentic, being real with them, and things you're nervous about versus I'm going to control you. Because you're right, you can't treat a 16-year-old like they're 10. That's going to lead to a lot of chaos in the house and the relationship. But part of it is engaging them. And again, it's engaging them in discussions, trying to guide them versus I'm going to control and wrangle this phone out of your hands with someone who's a junior in high school. So, but yeah, for sure, if you've waited a long time to have these discussions, it's going to be harder. And some personalities are just more, they're going to be tougher. And that. Some kids are going to be tough. And I think my daughter may be one of those. I know I would have been very tough I was pretty tough in my teens with my parents. We've had conversations with our high school daughter about separating work and play. And every time her response is, that's not how socializing with friends on technology works. They're talking all the time and she doesn't want me to miss out on a conversation. How do you recommend enforcing the separation of work and play? And I've had this conversation with my student it was hurting her sleep. Because again, her homework was taking 7 hours because she was constantly being interrupted with chats and texts and posts and videos. And so her homework was done poorly. She was getting, middling, failing grades. Her sleep was being disrupted. And so it's like, we have to address this because again, her functioning was being impaired. And so I do know, and your friends, there's again the fear of missing out. What if I miss the conversation? But when I'm working with kids, I'm like, you know what? It's going to be okay if you tell them, during this window between 4 and 6, I'm actually working. Between 6 and 7:30, I'm plugged in, and then I think it's a false notion that if I miss this thing, that I have to have my phone pinging me while I'm trying to write this term paper. And I've also been in that conversation, but I'm not a parent. I'm a coach. And so I think it may be a different dynamic because they're not trying to individuate for me. Like I'm trying to help them with their grades. But I realize it can be hard, but part of it is do the best you can. But it is a false sense of if I turn my phone off for an hour and a half. So I'm working with kids in high school and in college, and the world doesn't end if they put their phone on airplane mode for an hour and a half and do, knowing that there'll be a half an hour break and they can tell their friends that. But yeah, they may miss something, but the world doesn't end. But I realize for a high school kid that it may feel that way. How do we know when it actually becomes an addiction? It's when, again, the impairment of daily functioning, impairment with relationships, impairment with physical activity, weight gain, weight loss, sleep. Sleep's a major one. But just, in sleep and personal hygiene, that's when those are red flags. All right. With high school students, setting boundaries, are your cell phones for meetings might cause hostility but authority. Any suggestions on creating safe spaces for everyone about this matter of respect for each other, for example? And part of it, you have to model. And so you have to walk the walk and say, we are all going to create this space. We're going to have dinner together, all of us, 17-year-old, 45-year-old, 50 we're going to put our phones here. Because if you have to show them, this is, we're creating the structure. And this could be a negotiation. It's a first time, we've all had our phones, but now we're doing this. And ultimately, my suggestions are talking about the why we're doing it and the value of it. And hopefully, ideally, there'll be a level of engagement that's increased. And it's a matter of just respect for each other. So hopefully you start earlier if you're on this, but if you're starting late, I think you're going to have to try to get buy-in through just having a frank discussion. Doing me a solid, doing this, but admittedly, I have not had this discussion with my own kids. I'm starting off with them very young. I hope, but I'm sure there are more conflicts coming with this. I know there are. All right. Any final questions? And this is not easy. And technology and kids, it's not going to be easy. I know it. I'm seeing tiny struggles with my 2-year-old, and I know it's going to only increase. Because again, these things are designed they want more. And I don't blame them because I want more too. We all do. But we're going to have to learn how to manage and how to negotiate these devices. Have you ever tutored kids who are difficult to have a frank discussion with? Yeah, for sure. There are definitely kids who are less open. There are kids who are more receptive, and then there are kids who are less receptive. And I have to do part of it. I try to lead by sharing my stories, my vulnerability, trying to show a little bit of my wounds and my stuff, and to get them to see I'm totally imperfect in areas where I've fallen, areas where I've gotten in trouble, areas where I've gone too far, areas where I've been addicted, or I've had bad boundaries, areas where I've been a jerk. And so to me, it helps because again, versus me coming on high, I try to meet them where they are, try to meet them on their level. And that's one of the ways I try to win students over when I'm working with adolescent males or college level kids. I'm some guy, but I'm trying to create an alliance with them. And so I don't do that by coming on high. I do that by meeting them where they are. So again, vulnerability is my lead in. That's one of my secret sauces, if I can do it. Being authentic with them. Okay. Any other finals? Are we good to go? Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for that feedback. Everybody have a great night. I'm going to send you a copy of the deck within a couple of days, and please feel free to share, and we'll have more coming up next week and beyond. All right, all. Have a good night. Thank you.